Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. May I ask you all please to be seated? Welcome to the panel on rating presidents. My name is Dan Kevles. I am the moderator of this session. It's a pleasure to have with us four distinguished analysts and students of the presidency. On my left, not ideologically, but just physically, is Jay Kriegel, a longtime political
junkie.
Politically engaged since the Lindsay administration. And here is David Nasaw from CUNY, who is a distinguished biographer. And over here on my right.
And I'm really on your right.
You're really on my right, right? In all senses, is Ed Rollins, who is a longtime political advisor to presidents, including especially Ronald Reagan, even in his California days, if I have that correct. And Paul Krugman, who needs no introduction except to say he doesn't write only about economics, but also about a broad range of presidential policies. Our procedure this morning will be to ask you to register your rating of two presidents. One is Lyndon Johnson, and the second is Ronald Reagan. And then at the end, we will ask you also to register your assessment of our current president, Barack Obama. There will be two registrations for each president. One immediately, in which you are asked to rate the president as great, near great, average, below average, or a failure. And then the results will be kept confidential. And then at the end of the discussion of LBJ, we will ask you to rate LBJ again, and we'll see whether your opinions have changed at all as a result of the discussion. And then we'll go through the same exercise with Ronald Reagan, a registration before the discussion, a registration afterward with a report. And then if there is time, we'll have a brief discussion of Obama, but if there isn't, you will certainly get a chance to rate him as well, and the results will be instantly displayed. The order of procedure here is that each president will be discussed pro and con by two of the speakers. For LBJ, we have Jay Kriegel and David Nasaw, and then for Reagan, Ed Rollins and Paul Krugman. So since time is short, I'm going, without further ado, to ask Jay to begin with the case for LBJ. Oh, I'm sorry, first the registration. Great, near great, average, below, and failure. So can we have that up on the screen and give you the time to 10 seconds to register your views of each president.
Dan.
Okay, very good. And the results will be revealed to you after the discussion of LBJ. Jay?
Oh, we don't do the results before?
No.
And see the
no,
change?
Right.
And how long do you want us each to do?
5 minutes each.
Seems to me you all probably know too much about LBJ. He instantly invokes a bigger-than-life figure with supernatural powers of persuasion and, of course, the catastrophic conduct of the war. There's no dismissing excuse for not just the war, but also the way he did it with the deceit and secrecy. But I choose to look at LBJ for two major things. One, how he ascended to the presidency, and secondly, his impact on the life of the country. He became president, obviously, on one of the worst days in our history. Many of us remember when our gallant young president was struck down and the country in a state of shock. There's no precedent, really, for it in modern times. But what we know now is that every move that Lyndon made, from the tiny waiting on the plane for Jackie to get there before having the swearing in, to the grand, his first somber speech to the nation, was tone perfect. And he didn't have a team of PR wizards to do this for him. He did it all himself. And it appears to me that every single instinct he followed for those first days was absolutely flawless. And then he made a rather remarkable decision. He embraced JFK and JFK's vision, which he enhanced in his own language, and spent the next year, the last year of JFK's term, effectively being JFK's surrogate and instrument. to let the country honor JFK's memory. And in his name, he enacted a remarkable legislative program in 1964, especially the War on Poverty, and then the Great Civil Rights Act, which involved this extraordinary alliance with Everett Dirksen, the Republican Senate leader, to override the old line Southern Democrats and this massive filibuster led by his buddies, especially his great friend Dick Russell. That act really forced the South, still reluctant and sulking over the Civil War 100 years later, to join modern America, socially and economically. And I think it's fair to say today that the incredible vibrancy of the American South is a direct result of Lyndon Johnson's actions in 1964. I'd also say that in those 8 months, Johnson showed a vision about the country, combining equal rights racially with economic justice, dealing with economic inequality, for a kind of united vision of what to do with the disadvantaged that's only equaled by FDR. And yet, we all know about economic inequality today remains a severe problem. To me, it's interesting that Johnson's approach to it went so fundamentally deep in trying to deal with the underlying causes of economic inequality, not just the transfer of wealth. When he then got elected to his first full term by beating Barry Goldwater, he engaged in a just rampant explosion of legislation, which we know: Head Start, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, Medicaid, Medicare, the Immigration Reform Act of '65, much forgotten, but really changes the whole dynamic of America that we're living with today by moving immigration from Northern Europe to the rest of the country. And then especially the Voting Rights of '65, giving the country a very sensible reaction to this terrible violence in Selma. It's my first political involvement, really, in America, and yet what Johnson's response was in a historic speech to the Congress, which is I think one of the great American addresses, combining passion and foresight and American values, culminating in his great recitation of "We Shall Overcome." It's interesting to me that Johnson, who understood that compromise was so essential to the legislative process, seemed to him to be unacceptable and an issue of fundamental moral principles. So in summary, I think that the nation as we live in it today, the daily life of America 50 years later, is probably more impacted by Lyndon Johnson, despite his flaws, despite his vast doubts and insecurity, this man of staggering ambition and passion and power. But I don't think there's anybody in the last 100 years who's affected American life daily as much as Lyndon Johnson.
Thank you very much. David Nasaw.
We all choose the criteria on which we want to rate the presidents. And the one I want to choose is whether the president in question strengthened democracy, strengthened our faith in government, strengthened our faith in the efficacy of government. I start from the ground that we're suffering from many crises in this nation at this moment, and chief among them may be a crisis of democracy. We don't think about it very much because the voting participation rates have remained about 50% for a long time. It's not news anymore, but it should be news. What I ask of any president, again, was his legacy enhanced faith in government, a strengthening of our democracy, or less faith in government and a weakening of our democracy? The net effect of the Johnson presidency and the immediate aftermath, the Humphrey candidacy, was, I want to argue, to weaken democracy and the Democratic Party and to turn away from politics a generation, maybe 2 generations of young men and women. The Johnson presidency and the candidacy of Hubert Humphrey sounded the death knell of Democratic Party legitimacy for a sizable segment of those who should have formed the backbone of a progressive Democratic Party in the last third of the 20th century, having been lied to by the candidate who campaigned on the promise to keep us out of war, then lied to again and again and again by the president and his vice president and his cabinet, and has chosen military leaders and journalist cronies. Having witnessed the almost daily war crimes and atrocities committed by our government and our leaders, despairing about bringing about change in or through the Democratic Party, a large number of men and women of my generation moved away from the Democratic Party. Some, like Bernie Sanders, joined third parties. Bernie Sanders became a Democrat a couple of months ago when he decided to run for the presidency. Until then, he had not been a Democrat. Others might have continued to vote, but they abstained from working actively in or for government for the Democratic Party. FDR brought to Washington a cadre of brain trusters. JFK brought with him the so-called best and the brightest, and many from the universities. LBJ turned away future generations of progressive intellectuals and activists and politicos. But that is not the only way he weakened the Democratic Party and our faith in government and in democracy. There is nothing more pernicious than smashed expectations. And what Johnson did in creating a host of marvelous, innovative, progressive, Great Society programs, then defunding or underfunding them, thereby making them instant failures, was nothing short of criminal. The Vietnam War divided the nation, ripped apart families and communities, exacerbated town-gown, university-society relationships, destroyed the New Deal coalition of urban progressives and labor, prolonged and extended the Cold War, made the U.S. a pariah state, built up the military-industrial complex, robbed the infrastructure and non-military industrial capacity of investment opportunities, decreased productivity, increased government and balance of payments deficits, weakened the dollar, discouraged foreign investments, laid the seeds for the inflation, stagflation, and economic downturn of the 1970s. And it also destroyed the Great Society programs because Johnson refused to raise taxes to pay for his war. And the country could not afford guns and butter, guns and bread, so the Great Society programs were sacrificed. By making it impossible for these programs to succeed and inevitable that they fail, absent the funding they required, Johnson gave ammunition to those conservatives who were against any government intervention in social life, and to those who opposed, on a variety of grounds, any war on poverty. He made it easier to argue that welfare programs don't work. Black and Latino voters vote Democratic, but not because of these smashed expectations and the numbers needed to push a progressive agenda in the last third of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st.
Yeah.
Let me put
1 minute.
Okay, let me just put a bit of flesh on my arguments. The voter participation rate, which had been in the 70s and the 80s in the 19th century, fell dramatically, came back up with Eisenhower in 52, Kennedy in 60, Johnson in 64. And following the Johnson years, it fell dramatically, some 10 points, even accounting for increased voting in the South and increased voting of 18 to 21-year-olds. So there is flesh on this argument. There are numbers that show that the Johnson administration and its aftermath led to a weakening of democracy, a weakening of our belief in the efficacy of government, and that is attested to by voter registration and voter participation figures.
Thank you. Jay, what would you like to say in response?
I know a lot of bright people who went to work for Democrats after Lyndon. I think there's a lot of truth to some of that, but I think Johnson's overarching impact on the country and particularly the two civil rights bills. You know, stroke of the pen, having 10 million people previously denied the right to vote is we're today in the midst still of the legacy, figuring out what to do about race. Nobody in 50 years has done more about that fundamental American problem than Lyndon. To me, that's the most important issue we face as a society, have faced in my lifetime, will continue to. Economic inequality is profoundly important, but race is really the deepest drama. And Lyndon saw it and dealt with it in a way as nobody else in modern American history.
David, I'd like to jump in here and ask why you can say that basically Johnson almost single-handedly destroyed the progressive coalition dating back to FDR.
Yeah.
When it's a commonplace that the upheavals of the civil rights era, including the legislative responses of Johnson himself, as Jay just alluded to, the two Civil Rights Act, fractured the Democratic South, and he himself said that this is the end of Democratic control in the South. And also the riots, the upheavals, and so on as the civil rights movement moved north, alienated a lot of whites in the North, especially blue-collar labor. So is this really to be attributed to Johnson? I mean, it's Johnson's policies, but they were the right policies.
I don't want, look, if I had had more time, and in my prepared remarks I said, of course there are other factors, but didn't have time to say that. Yes, of course there are other factors. Of course we can't blame Johnson entirely for any of this. And yet the fact remains that the Johnson-Humphrey regime of lies and of deceit turned away and turned off democracy in government. I mean, the figures are in non-Southern turnout rate was 70% in 1960, 67% in 1964. Something happens. And the Democratic base, the demographics that support Democratic Party voting, the demographics of the FDR coalition, they changed dramatically by 10, 15% in a period of 10 years. And I think that has a lot to do, and it is not simply, the privileged sons and daughters like myself of the upper middle class who walk away from politics. It's not simply the New Left. It's a lot of other people. Those people who should have benefited from the Great Society programs, who thought they would benefit from the Great Society programs, but did not.
Jay, do you want to jump in?
Well, of course, the irony of the Roosevelt Southern, the Roosevelt coalition is based on a racist South. And so it is not a progressive coalition. Roosevelt's coalition is a very fraught one. And by the time you get to the 60s, you have both the South, which is now cast asunder, which we give to Rollins happily for his policy.
Thank you, we'll take it.
Reagan, and the labor movement, which first fragments over Vietnam, but today remains at least the core. The Peter Brennan, who becomes Reagan's labor secretary, leads what is also a movement which is divided today in New York City on racial lines, is still the most exclusionary institutions in the country. So the labor movement is really split in half today. Very progressive unions dealing with income inequality and race and the underclass, but very establishment, really reactionary conservative unions. So the coalition is being remade today in these border states in a much healthier way, I believe, on much more progressive principles than the old coalition ever was.
Let me jump in here again, exercising my duty as moderator, and shift the discussion a little bit and question the premise of your remarks, which is that the principal criterion by which we judge or rate a president should be whether the president advances trust in government, et cetera, the operations of government, voter participation, and so on. One can argue that the democratic project is advanced in multiple ways, including economic opportunity, better outcomes, as we were talking about yesterday, in equality, and also in economic security. So if you look at just two consequences of LBJ's policies, one is Medicare and Medicaid, I think you would be hard put to quarrel with those things advancing the democratic project. And secondly, the more quiet, at least through the 70s, consequences of the affirmative action exercised through the authority given the Civil Rights Act to the president to enforce equality of opportunity for women by federal contractors, by minority groups, and so on. And you begin to see quite an economic change developing among women and especially African Americans beginning in the 1970s, so that by the 80s we have an emergence of a much more substantial black middle class than had existed before. So why should we just measure rate of president and this one dimension of the democratic project?
Because I think that the central issue of 20th century politics is the relationship of state and society. I mean, all you have to do is listen to the last Republican debate and then listen to the Democratic debates. The Republicans have claimed over and over again that the state, a strong state, is the problem, that the state cannot do anything positive in terms of economic regulation, economic development, and that we can't legislate morality or ethics. The 20th century, since Reconstruction, certainly since the New Deal, has been, what is the role of the state? Do we want a strong state that will participate in the promotion of economic development, the promotion of social justice, the lessening of income inequality? Or do we want the market, traditions, mores to rule and the state to stay away? Because I think this is the central issue of 20th century politics. I think it is legitimate to rate the presidents on whether, when they left, the American population, the American public, has a sense of government's efficacy, that government is part of the solution, or government is part of the problem. Whether democracy is strengthened, whether people believe in democracy, or whether they walk away and say, none of this matters.
Okay, I wish we could go on with this discussion about LBJ, but it's time now for you to register your opinions about your rating of LBJ, great, near great, average, below average, or a failure in light of the discussion. So please make your vote. You have 10 seconds. And then we'll report to you the registration at the beginning of the discussion, the registration at the end. Okay. Can we have the results?
One person shifted. Congratulations.
Okay. So we now turn to Ronald Reagan. I asked you to go through the same exercise to rate Reagan on the dimensions that we've presented to you: great, near great, average, below, and failure. You have 10 seconds, starting now. Okay. So our first speaker presenting the case for Reagan is Ed Rollins.
Thank you. I appreciate having 5 minutes to cover 16 years of his life and 8 years of his presidency, but it's okay. I'll do it. When Ronald Reagan came into office, and he was a man who was always underestimated. When he first ran for governor of California against Edmund Brown, the father of the present governor, Brown wanted to run against Reagan. He was a movie star. He certainly couldn't become the governor of California. He was laughed at. When he was running for president after 8 successful years of both being the governor of California and really the conservative leader for about 12 years in the country, Jimmy Carter, a presidency that was obviously in a downward trend, clearly wanted to run against Reagan. They knew they could beat Reagan. The truth of the matter is Reagan has spent his life being underestimated. I think no one would, when he started the process, would ever think of him being one of the great presidents, and maybe the people on the stage would not think of him as a great president. I teach a course in the presidency at Hofstra University. He gets rated by most historians today in the top element. go around the world today, especially Eastern Europe, he's rated as one of the great presidents. But I think the most important thing about Reagan is Reagan came into office when the presidency wasn't working. We had the assassination of Kennedy, which certainly wasn't, it was a very detrimental thing to the country. We had the failure of Lyndon Johnson, in spite of the things that you talk about, and I'm a big Lyndon Johnson fan. I think he was an extraordinary president, won by an enormous landslide, was the first president I ever voted for. I was a Democrat in those days. But he was, at the end, he was a failure. He was driven from office. He couldn't basically go anywhere in America and make a speech because of the war. You had Richard Nixon, who followed him, who was basically on the verge of impeachment when he left office. You had Gerald Ford, who was voted out of office, and you had Jimmy Carter, who basically blamed the American public for the national malaise. So Reagan came into office, and people didn't think the presidency could work. And about 2 years later, the New York Times and others were complaining that it was working, but he was doing it part-time. He was taking Wednesdays off to ride horses and what have you. I think what he did is he restored so much of the country, and first and foremost, his goal was to restore the military. We sort of forget what the Soviets were like in the old days, and we had this nuclear standoff from a policy from the Kennedy era of mutual assured destruction. Both the Soviets and we basically were building enormous stockpiles of nuclear weapons. And Reagan, who was thought of as a warmonger, wasn't. Reagan was just the opposite, particularly after he was shot and damn near killed. Most people don't realize he bled out 2 months into his presidency. And when he survived, he said, God didn't put me on this earth to basically create a nuclear war. He went off to one of these simulations, and the way that the mutual assistance, we each had about 20,000 plus nuclear weapons, the Soviets enough. In about 10 minutes, the world was destroyed, and he walked away from that extremely shook up. And the premise was we have these thousands and thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons with missiles and submarines and everything aimed at each other. In a very short period of time, after they drop about 400 on each side, there's nothing left but rubble, and any additional dropping of nuclear weapon would just be bouncing the rubble around the world. And so he got into a mindset, I've got to deal with the Russians in a way that I can basically rebuild the strength of the country. And so his premise of peace through strength was, and we all forget now that in the post-Vietnam War, we hadn't done anything with our military. We had a very disillusioned military, and we had soldiers and sailors on food stamps. We had ships that couldn't sail. We had planes that couldn't fly. And he went out and spent an enormous sum of money, made a very heavy commitment with the support of Democrats and Republicans to rebuild the military of this country, which was extremely important at that point in time. That gave us a position of strength where we could sit down opposite the table with the Soviets. And you have to understand the first 3 Soviet premiers, when he was in office, died very quickly and never had the opportunity to meet with them. But finally was able to sit this thing down and slow this thing down and get to a point where it was very important. The second thing that he set out to do is he thought the tax rates were much too high. Having been a movie star in the 40s, tax rates were 90%, they were still 70%. I often chuckle when the hero of the Democrats, John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy did 2 things in his presidency that were very important. He rebuilt the defenses of the country, and he cut taxes. So as Reagan used to say, and I used to say as a Boston Irish Catholic kid who grew up in California, my first hero was John Kennedy. The first president I worked for in the White House was Ronald Reagan, who moved. Obviously, Reagan basically attracted a lot of blue-collar Democrats, became a party that changed dramatically. You gave us the South, and we appreciate that. It's a very strong portion of our coalition today. You want to throw anything else in, California, New York, we'd be very happy to take it, but I'm not sure it's going to happen in my lifetime. The second thing is he reduced the taxes, 25% on everyone the first 3 years. Then he reduced the top rate from 70%, which everyone in this room would be paying today, with a lot of deductions and a lot of things of you'd be spending a lot more time with your accountants, down to 2 rates, 26 and 16. The third thing he did is he redirected the direction of government. He wanted to reset priorities. He worked very hard on that, wasn't able to do all that he wanted to do there because the Democrats control Congress. When we came into Washington in 1980, we barely could find a place to land. Reagan National Airport is now named after him. The largest building in Washington, which he spent 8 years trying to kill, was the Daniel Moynihan Cultural Center, which is now the Ronald Reagan Building. Ronald Reagan had an impact on this country, had an impact across the world, and you can nitpick a lot of different things he did. The Iran-Contra thing is not something I would defend, but at the end of the day, did he make the presidency work again? Did Americans feel better about themselves? And you have to remember, I mean, Carter's, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1980. Carter's premise was we won't sell them our wheat and we won't send our sprinters and our javelin throwers to the Moscow Olympics. We basically stood up to them. We forced them out of Afghanistan. We basically stood up to them to where they were willing to sit down and negotiate nuclear missiles, and it's a much safer world today than it was when he was there, even though it's still a very unsafe world. So I think if you ask the American public, he came to a town, Washington, which was very cynical, didn't particularly welcome us to the town. He showed how you can work with the Congress. The vast majority, when he came back, when he was almost mortally wounded, with his humor and his strength, and he addressed the Congress 3 weeks afterwards, and he had an unprecedented passage of legislation that really changed things very dramatically.
Okay, thank you. Paul?
Okay. I'm not going to go trashing Reagan. I think all we really need to do is to get straight the difference between the legend of Reagan and the reality. So I think there's actually two dimensions in which I assess Reagan. The first is, what did he actually do for the country? Actually, as opposed to the legend. And then the second is, how far did he get in actually pushing his own agenda in the end, now that we have some hindsight? So on the first one, so we have I've talked mostly about the economics. We have the legend of Reagan. You keep on seeing Republican politicians say things like, the last time we created millions of jobs was when Reagan cut taxes. And they sort of seem to forget this guy named Clinton, who actually had a much, much better job creation record. But I'd like to show just one slide, just to show you how. So this is something, I was actually a little surprised myself. This is unemployment rates over the course of a presidency, starting in starting in the month of inauguration, under Ronald Reagan and this other guy you may have heard of. And sorry about the color scheme. I've got blue for the Republican and red for the Democrat here. Did you know that Ronald Reagan came into office with an unemployment rate that was lower than the unemployment rate that when Obama came into office, and that at this point, unemployment is lower than it was at this point in the Reagan administration? If you believe that there was this wonderful, incredible prosperity under Reagan, and now the unemployment rate is not the only indicator. And there are, I can start to say, okay, look, we've had a decline in labor force participation, which is mostly, but not entirely, about demographics and aging. But if you're explaining, you're losing. The actual track record does not at all justify the belief that there was this incredible prosperity under Reagan. What you had was a very severe recession, followed by under his watch, followed by a quick recovery, neither of which had much to do with Reagan's policy. It was all really about Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve. But that gets built into the legend of an enormous economic triumph, which actually never happened. One thing that's interesting about Reagan is, I'm old enough, I think actually all of us are, to remember the early 1990s, after Reagan and Bush 1 had been through, and this country was in a terrible funk. People who think that Reagan turned us around and we were all in great optimism, it just wasn't true. We had best-selling books in the early 90s with titles like America, What Went Wrong? We had Lester Thoreau writing books about how we were losing the race with Europe and Japan. And what turned it around was America's technological boom, starting in the mid-90s under some other guy as president. And so now people backcast that turnaround to Ronald Reagan, which is not actually, didn't happen then. People were feeling pretty bad about America well into the 1990s, and it wasn't until that great internet IT boom that people felt a lot better. Actually, the running joke at the time was the Cold War is over, Japan won. Give you a sense of what the sense that people had back. So now history is being rewritten by constant fostering of the legend to make it seem that Reagan was responsible for the turnaround, but he wasn't. Let me say something about Reagan's own agenda. Now, his goal was to really undo the Great Society and the New Deal. Back in his early years, Reagan campaigned against Medicare, saying that Medicare would destroy American freedom. He came into office, actually, with the intention of sharply cutting back and possibly dismantling Social Security. And what I think is really quite interesting is that none of that happened. That when all is said and done, the major institutions of the New Deal and the Great Society survived, and here we are now with kind of Rube Goldberg slapdash, but nonetheless, universal health care, We've actually, in the end, the progressive agenda, in a spotty, but fundamentally, Reagan lost that battle. If we ask, did the country end up going where Reagan wanted it to go? It did not. Oh, and by the way, one thing that's also kind of surprising about tax cuts. So first of all, people do forget that Reagan, while he did do a big tax cut, he also oversaw one of the biggest tax increases in U.S. history, big increase in payroll taxes to sustain Social Security, which was not what he wanted to do, but ended up having to do. But at this point, if we talk about the top 1%, latest estimates from the Congressional Budget Office say that the effective tax rate on the 1% in America is roughly now back to what it was in 1979. That between the expiration of some of the Bush tax cuts, the special surcharges that are associated with financing Obamacare, Obama has pretty much rolled back the Reagan tax cuts. It's a very different form, actually a healthier form. We used to have very high notional rates that nobody paid, and now we have a system where there are fewer people dodging taxes by investing in horse farms, and more people actually paying a somewhat lower headline tax rate. But if you actually looked, if you were to look at America as it was in '79, look at America as it is now, you would have said, oh, this is a period of slow but gradual victory for the social democratic left in America. You probably, if you didn't know what had gone in between, you would not have been aware that there was this guy named Reagan who supposedly had led a triumph against the notion of a more expansive government.
Paul, can you
Yeah, so basically, Reagan was a mediocre president in terms of economic results and failed in his policy agenda, for which I am very grateful.
Ed?
All I can say is I'm sorry the tech didn't come. I'm sure Bill Clinton had total responsibility for that.
No,
but here's what we inherited. Let me talk.
Yeah.
20 million new jobs were created. Unemployment was 7.6 when we came in, 5.5. There's 92 million people out of the workforce right today. The net worth of middle-class families between 20,000 and 50,000 grew at 27%. Inflation was 13.5 in 1980. It's now 4.1% when Reagan left. The prime interest rate was slashed more than half, an unprecedented 21.5% in January 1981 to 10%. The bottom line is Ronald Reagan made Americans feel good about themselves again. And as I said, he made the presidency work again. He won 59% of the vote when he ran for re-election against your candidate, Walter Mondale. So, at the end of the day, you go around the world, the president people talk about is Ronald Reagan. He has unified the Republican Party in this country. You guys may not like it, and as usual, I'm outnumbered here 3-1, 4-1, but it's okay. The reality is he basically made Americans appreciate themselves again, and that was a good thing.
I think what we're talking about is there's an extraordinary success here, and it's the extraordinary success of the conservative legend-making machine.
Thank you. I appreciate
that this is what people think about Ronald Reagan, including people who were, who not necessarily conservatives, but that they've heard that story. They keep on thinking. You keep on hearing about all those millions of jobs. I think most people are completely unaware that any kind of employment or growth number that you might cite for Reagan is topped by a large margin by what happened under Bill Clinton. In both cases, by the way, had almost nothing to do with the president. I don't give Bill Clinton credit for the boom in productivity in the 90s. I don't give Reagan credit for the recovery from the 81-82 recession. Those had other things. But the point is, what we've seen now is that decades of consistent propaganda about what Reagan. Actually, what was Joe Klein's line about the 2012 Republican debates was, what they said was Reagan, God, Reagan. I mean, that style of rhetoric and the constant driving home, naming airports after him, has created a legend, but it's not what actually happened. And it was not, and Americans did not feel good about themselves in the early 1990s. Sorry.
Unfortunately, Reagan was the president during the 80s. So.
Yeah, but the point was that there was a lot of, in 92, do you remember Bill Clinton had ads where they had some of the people who had featured in the Morning in America commercials, and they got some of those people back to talk about how their lives had
First of all, get your facts right. It was not Ronald Reagan's commercials. They were George Bush's commercials in 1988.
Oh, all right.
Okay, all right.
Good.
So make sure your facts are right, and let's have at least the New York Times standard. Yeah? The reality is, You love Obama. I read you every day or whenever you write, and it's you love Obama, and obviously we'll see you 10 years from now when we're sitting on the stage.
But that's irrelevant.
This is about
That's losing the thread
Let me
here.
jump in about
Sure.
on the point of legend making. When Ronald Reagan tripled the debt of the United States, okay, so and he just deflected the criticism by saying, "Oh, the debt is now grown big enough so it can take care of itself." So how do you respond to that as a kind of conservative? Because the roles on the debt flipped from their historical norms, which is the Republicans are defending
and what's
the rise
what's happened
in
to the debt since? I mean, let's be perfectly honest. The debt has obviously continued to grow. We didn't have a Republican Congress. We had a Senate, and the bottom line, we had a coalition in the first 2 years in which we did a great deal of defense buildups and what have you. But the Democrats redrew the lines, and they had a majority in the House for a long period of time. And so, any kind of change you wanted to make. I'm not an economist. You have a Pulitzer Prize, you have a Nobel Prize. I'm not going to sit here and argue with you about economics.
I'll take that Pulitzer even though I don't have it. But anyway,
Well, you hire me, I'll get you
give me
the
the
I'll
South,
hire me, I'll create the image for you, I'll get you the Pulitzer.
anyway.
Ronald Reagan was more than an image. Ronald Reagan was someone who the American public felt very, very good about the presidency. And there's three elements to politics. A president, like people like me, have to help him govern and what have you. Political scientists can go back, of which that's my field, go back 10 years later and they say, well, this is really what happened. I don't care if you were in the room, this is really what happened. Historians go back 25, 30 years later, and 40 years later, and they make people great presidents who may be or may not be. I think Ronald Reagan today, I think the words of his countrymen, they love him, and whether it was PR or what have you, they made him feel good about it, made the presidency work again.
Okay. I mean, how? That's kind of circular, right? Say Ronald Reagan was a great president because people thought he was a great president. Now, because people now think that he was a great
They
president.
did then too.
Well, they did for a little while. I mean, and what I'll say, election results, what we actually really know, what political scientists really tell us, is election results, presidential elections, depend a lot on how fast the economy is growing in the 6 months before the election. So, yeah, I no longer have the chart, but that rapid recovery from the terrible recession meant a landslide victory. But no, but let me just stay with this. In terms of the actual economic outturns, the big turnaround in America's we had a long funk of lousy productivity growth that ended in the mid-90s, not under Reagan. I actually somehow failed to even mention income inequality. So one thing that really did change, and we don't know how much Ronald Reagan is responsible for it, but that enormous decoupling of the living standards of ordinary American families from the growth of the economy as a whole, that begins about 1980. So if you ask what really did change under Reagan, it is, well, that's when we started to see the soaring incomes at the top, the falling incomes at the bottom. Some of that may be due to Reagan's policies. It's actually pretty hard to find exactly what caused those things. But that's certainly not a record to be proud of. And to the extent that people are worried about income inequality now, that's because you can say, well, they're worried about the trend that began under Ronald Reagan. I'm not making that the core of my argument. My argument is not so much that he was a terrible president as that the legend bears no resemblance to what actually happened, which was not all that impressive when all is said and done.
Well, 30 years later, people still think fondly of him. And I think presidents get too much credit and too much blame for the economy. There's a lot of other factors that are involved in it.
That for
but
sure.
I go back to the premise I started with. We thought the presidency wouldn't work anymore. We had a series of failed presidencies. He certainly made Americans feel good about themselves again.
Well, one thing presidents are responsible for is foreign policy, which we haven't touched on. We thought we might give it at least a minute or so to that. So what would each of you have to say about Reagan's record there? I think that I haven't done a poll around the world, but I think people around the world who revere Ronald Reagan do so because of his association with the end of the Cold War. But then again, there's a legend, I would say, that he ended it. That's not true. Well, he was participated in the end.
And I say this is a different thing. Americans, we think that the whole world revolves around what we do, and that the speeches that American presidents give determine what happens. I mean, but we can. Communism was ready to collapse, is my view. And credit to Reagan, and particularly Reagan was a much. Reagan was actually willing to deal. He was actually a peaceful guy. I mean, Reagan would be hounded out of the Republican debates right now because he was much too reasonable on foreign policy.
Well, people say that to me all the time. Ronald Reagan could be the one that Ronald Reagan was a skilled politician who could change any party anytime he chose. He evolved from a FDR Democrat to become a very conservative Republican, and he took a lot of people along with him.
Okay, we have a chance now you have a chance to register once again your views of Ronald Reagan, rating him as either great, near great, average, below average, or a failure. So take that registration, and then we'll move to Obama. Okay, may we see the before and after results?
So I failed miserably to make my case. Huh? One person changed their mind.
I think what we got is
Preconceived ideas.
no one.
Significant drop in below average.
I think some of the people. It's.
Near great. That's where the rise is.
I think this is two people.
Yeah.
It is. Plus or minus 12, so it's just.
Yeah. We have these regular surveys of economists that's very useful to. What do economists think? And on a number of issues, we actually say, oh yeah, there's consensus except Alberto. He seems to be.
Well, we have about 3.5 minutes left. We're going to take a registration on your rankings of Obama, but I wonder if anybody would like to jump in for the ridiculous time of 30 seconds, each of you, to say anything about Obama. That is Jay, David, Paul, Ed.
You want any questions? No, David?
Well, can I just say a word about Obama?
Yeah.
Leave aside whether you think it's good or bad. In terms of actually changing the American system, changing how the country works, Obama's going to leave a much larger footprint than Reagan did. Reagan came in hostile to the Social Security and Medicare. They're still there. Obama came in and is leaving us with a national guarantee of health insurance, which is something Democrats have been trying to get for 70 years, and it happened. It's not the system any of us would have designed from scratch, but if you're looking for an enduring legacy that will change the way people live, Obama's doing that in a way that Reagan never did.
Any of the rest of you want to say anything about Obama?
I think he's come back from a terrible funk, and he's had 6 excellent months, beginning with the Supreme Court decision on ACA, which is profoundly important to him, followed by a trade deal which shows bipartisanship, not being stuck in ideology. 2 great foreign policy successes, Cuba and Iran. The first one relatively easy, been sitting there to be picked up. The second one difficult. And if he ends up, he doesn't have time to do much. If he can do one final big deal with the Koch brothers, in effect, dragging the rest of the party behind him on criminal justice reform, which we talked about yesterday, I think he'll end up surprisingly strong with a surprisingly good legacy.
David, Ed?
I think the president was a historic president, obviously the first African-American. He put together 2 brilliant campaigns, which he brought a lot of young people to the game, a lot of African-Americans, a lot of Hispanics that hadn't voted before. So I think from that perspective, it was very. I think the only criticism I have of him, having worked for a couple presidents, I've been in the White House with a couple presidencies, is the president has access to anybody in the world he wants to. I think this president has made a deliberate decision not to have access to outside people, and I think to a certain extent, you highlight the things that have gone thanks to Republicans and what have you recently, but I think at the end of the day, we'll sit here a couple years from now, and hopefully I'll still be alive, and we can basically critique his presidency.
David?
I want to see 5 years from every historian, so I don't make instant analyses. But 5 years from now, I'll come back and I'll tell you what I think.
Okay, you all now have an opportunity to register your rating of Barack Obama on the same dimensions: great, near great, average, below average, and failure.
Wow.
Great, average. Wow,
That's interesting.
pretty revealing.
That's pretty strong.
Yeah,
Surprising.
right. A solid, substantial majority of great or near great.
Of this audience. Sorry, I love you. Thank you for.
I want to thank each of our speakers, Ed Rollins, Paul Krugman, David Nasaw, and Jay Kriegel, and all of you for coming.
Paul, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Well done.